If you believe that love can flourish quietly, gradually, sometimes in the most unexpected places, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button. What you're about to experience isn't simply a romance tale. It's a voyage through quietude, remembrance, and the type of bond that transforms everything. I was 24 when I wed a stranger. The dress wasn't chosen by me. The wedding band felt too weighty. Above us, the crystal chandelier wavered subtly, as though it also questioned the promises we were preparing to make. What I recall most vividly is the hush, not the gentle kind, that settles peacefully between two souls who comprehend one another. This was the frigid quiet of ceremony, of business dealings, of acceptance. No giggles, no melodies. Only the sound of costly footwear shuffling across marble and the measured tone of an attorney reciting conditions that resembled a business agreement more than sacred vows. My fingers shook as I gripped the pen. Across from me stood a man tall, flawlessly attired in a charcoal suit, observing without truly seeing. Ethan Grant. That name alone possessed the power to purchase entire cities. And now it would claim me, or rather my surname, my family's obligations, and a signature that would transform me into Mrs. Grant before I could fully grasp its implications. All preparations are complete, he stated, his voice controlled and deliberate. Your signature is all that remains. He appeared neither heartless nor compassionate, simply determined. In that instant, my thoughts drifted to my mother, her. Breathing shallow and fragile in that hospital bed 2 towns over, she remained unaware of today's ceremony. I hadn't informed her, not from a lack of wanting her presence, but because I couldn't bear for her to witness what this truly was. A young woman trading herself through ink and silence. And so I signed. They claim weddings should feel like fresh starts. Mine felt like bidding farewell to aspirations, to independence, to every concept of love I'd once held dear. The Grant mansion stood hushed, almost sacred in its sophistication. Rich wooden floors, golden accents, artwork that appeared costly, yet emotionally vacant, as if displayed by someone who felt nothing from it. The bedroom where I was escorted contained pristine white linens, the type found in luxury hotels, not family homes. No blossoms were present. No hint of lavender or warmth, just cedar, polish, and silence. I perched on the bed's edge, fingers trailing along my gown's hem, one I had modified myself. It was previously owned, gifted by a friend from the boutique, where I once worked. I had tightened the lace around the waist, not from a desire for perfection, but because it gave me something to command. My luggage sat untouched in the corner. I had packed minimally, several dresses, my mother's cherished teacup, and a weathered Bible she always kept nearby. I retrieved it now, more for its comforting weight than spiritual guidance. When I opened it, something fell out of folded paper, yellowed and delicate, bearing my mother's handwriting across the top. I gazed at it momentarily, my heart suddenly racing like when I was a child caught sneaking sweets. This letter was unfamiliar to me. Dear Mr. Grant, it began. I'm uncertain if this will ever find you. Perhaps it shouldn't, but I am writing. For my daughter's sake, should you ever encounter her, she doesn't deserve the burden of her father's failings. I froze. My mother rarely spoke of my father. He had vanished from our lives when I was 10, leaving behind unpaid debts and silence. I knew he had betrayed people. I didn't know he had betrayed someone named Grant. The letter continued. Your grandfather was a decent man. He offered my husband more opportunities than he merited. I still remember when he visited our home with those sorrowful eyes, asking nothing in return. If my daughter ever enters your life, please don't make her pay for what preceded her. The words struck me like ice water. Ethan Grant. E. Grant. Could this be the same person? This marriage, was it truly just about money, or something deeper? a resolution of an ancient wound, generations old. I set the letter down with trembling hands. It altered something within me, not immediately, but like a seed planted in still earth. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan knew more than he revealed, that perhaps in his quiet way of looking at me without speaking, there was a story behind his silence too. Still, the bed felt enormous that night and the house too quiet. I wrapped the sheets around myself and listened to the wind outside pressing against the tall glass windows. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock ticked, the kind that measured time not in seconds. But indecisions, that was my first night as someone's wife. Not in love, not in hope, but in a kind of peaceful surrender. Yet, clutching my mother's letter beneath my pillow, I discovered something strange in my chest, an ache that didn't feel like regret. It felt like the first crack in a wall I hadn't realized I'd built around myself. And perhaps, just perhaps, it meant this story was far from over. Mornings at the Grand Estate arrived like unexpected visitors, quiet, remote, and impossible to dismiss. Sunlight touched everything gently, even the expensive hardwood and towering windows, as though uncertain of its welcome. Neither was I wandered the corridors barefoot, my solace brushing against rugs I would never select, in a home that wasn't mine. I hadn't properly seen Ethan since our wedding day. He hadn't entered the bedroom that first night or the second. He hadn't attempted conversation, nor had I sought him out. We were two individuals occupying the same space like passengers on an extended train journey, aware of each other's presence, yet too polite or too wounded to speak. Each morning, I observed him from a distance, standing beyond the glass wall of the east wing, coffee in hand, gazing into the pine forest beyond. The estate always solitary, always motionless. That's how I came to think of him, the man beyond the glass. Someone constructed for distance, someone who learned too early how to survive without warmth. Yet something about his posture contradicted the coldness, the way his shoulders curved slightly inward, as if bearing the weight of something invisible. A memory, perhaps, or a name he still carried in his heart. I wondered if my mother's name resided there too. The letter haunted me more than our silence. I had tucked it back into the Bible, uncertain whether to destroy it, conceal it, or confront him with it. He hadn't given me reason to speak, only that single glance during our ceremony and the instruction to sign my name. But now there was something else, a thread I couldn't unravel, a memory planted before my birth. I spent the third morning sitting alone at the breakfast table, picking at perfectly brown toast. The staff here didn't smile, they weren't unkind, but they avoided eye contact. I was the young bride of a distant billionaire, likely a temporary fixture, like the seasonal flowers arranged in the entryway, but someone had placed a tray before me that morning, not just toast and eggs, but a small teacup filled with warm jasmine tea. The fragrance reached me before I saw it. My mother's favorite, the one she drank whenever she was worried or weary or quietly grieving. It wasn't on the standard menu. I hadn't requested it. No one had. I glanced at the housekeeper, but she quickly busied herself with the silverware. The tea was already steeped, the temperature perfect, not scalding, not lukewarm, but ideal in a way only someone who paid close attention could achieve. I said nothing. I simply wrapped my hands around the porcelain and let the steam caress my face like my mother's breath on my forehead when I was small. That afternoon, I found myself drifting toward the east wing, not intentionally, just walking or perhaps searching for something unnamed. The glass walls stretched floor to ceiling, a clear barrier between the estate and the towering forest outside. Ethan stood there, his back to me, coffee in one hand, the other tucked in his pocket. He wore a dark sweater this time, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His profile was sharper than I remembered, as if carved for silence. I nearly left, but then He spoke. Your mother used to hum while preparing jasmine tea. My breath caught. He didn't turn around, his voice low and steady, almost like a prayer. I was 12 the last time I saw her. She had paint on her hands and told me not to tell your father she'd spent the grocery money on brushes. I stepped forward slowly. You knew her. He nodded. Long ago, before everything became complicated. Why didn't you mention this? Now he turned. His eyes were darker than I remembered, but not cold, just tired, just worn. Because you needed space to hate me if that's what it took to survive this. I didn't want to take that from you. I stared at him, speechless. He added, the TI. Didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It didn't, I whispered. It helped. Something shifted in the air between us, not warmth. Not yet, but a gentle loosening, like opening a window in a long-sealed room. That night, I sat in the bedroom alone again, but it didn't feel quite as cold. I lit the bedside lamp and opened. My mother's Bible. I didn't read, just ran my fingers along the paper's edges, touching something that had endured. The letter remained there, but now it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a key dot. Ethan was beyond glass, but glass after. All isn't a wall. It's a surface waiting to be touched, waiting to reflect what's real. And I was beginning to see the shape of a man whose silence wasn't cruelty, it was memory. And maybe, just maybe, he remembered me too. Some truths don't arrive with thunder, they come with the gentle weight of certainty. That morning, I returned home for the first time since our wedding. My mother's voice had trembled through the phone the previous night, asking if I might visit. Only if you have time, she'd said, though I knew her well enough to hear the tremor beneath her grace. Ethan said little when I told him, just nodded and said he had arranged the driver. Then, as I prepared to leave, he surprised me. I'll accompany you. I blinked. You don't need to. He met my eyes. I know. We spoke little during the drive. The silence between us had transformed, though it no longer stretched like a chasm. It was quieter, softer, like shared breath on a winter windowpane dot. My childhood home still carried the scent of peppermint oil and dust. The carpet creaked beneath our steps, and I half expected to hear my father's voice calling from the back room, though he'd been gone for years. But there was only my mother now, small and graceful in her armchair, wrapped in a blanket she had crocheted in better times. When she saw Ethan, something flickered in her eyes, not surprise, but recognition. She smiled, but remained silent for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly on the blanket's hem. I wasn't certain you'd come, she finally said to him, her voice thin as parchment. I owed it to you, Ethan replied simply. I looked between them. You know each other? They both paused. My mother closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, misty and unguarded. I knew him before he had a name that mattered, before the suits, before all this. Her hand gestured toward the man Ethan had become, but I sensed she was really pointing at something deeper, at a history I hadn't been allowed to touch. I used to paint, you know, she said softly, almost apologetically. Before the debts. Before your father took what little we had and gambled it away. I nodded. I'd seen the paintings and the attic dreamy oils of pine trees and misty fields. I never knew they were hers. I met Ethan's grandfather at a church art auction years ago. He purchased a piece I made for $10 more than it was worth, just to be kind. I saw Ethan smile, then barely, but it was there. He and your father became friends, she continued, until they weren't. It was strange how pain created its own silence in a room. I sat on the floor beside her as I had when small. My mother's fingers brushed my hair gently. Your father borrowed more than he could repay, not just money, but trust. He broke promises to his friend, to me. Her voice trembled again. When your father disappeared, it was Mr. Grant who helped me survive those first winters. He sent groceries, paid your school fees once, though I told you it was a scholarship. Ethan shifted beside me, not speaking, just watching her with eyes that had known all this for years. And then she said, looking at me, he died quietly, but not before asking Ethan to promise him one thing: take care of my family, not for revenge, not for a payment, but because some debts can only be settled with grace. I couldn't speak. All this time, I thought I had been purchased, traded to a cold man for unpaid bills. But now I saw the truth. I had been offered a place, not because I was useful, but because I was loved, once removed. Because a boy had grown into a man who honored a promise to someone long gone. Even when no one remembered it, later, Ethan and I sat on the porch. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the sky was lavender and gold quiet colors that didn't demand attention. I thought you hated him, I said. I did, Ethan answered. But hating someone doesn't erase the part of you that's still grateful. He sipped his tea, and I noticed for the first time that he drank it exactly as I did, no sugar, just the faint bitterness of the leaf. I didn't marry you to punish you, he added after a moment. I married you because it was the only way I knew how to keep the promise. I looked at him, really looked. The boy who had once watched my mother paint, the young man who had carried anger not as a weapon, but as armor. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted you to choose who I was, not who your mother remembered or who your father wronged. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It hummed with something unnamed. Not love, not yet, but something close to understanding. When he offered his hand to help me up from the porch, I didn't hesitate. His poem was warm, firm, somehow familiar. And for the first time since our wedding, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a thread of fragile connection that had somehow endured. Passed between generations, waiting to be held again. It was the sound of the kettle that undid me, not the gentle whistle of boiling water, but the clink of porcelain, deliberate, unhurried. A sound I'd grown up with, a sound that used to mean everything would be okay. At least for that moment, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my childhood home, exhausted, numb from the day. My mother was resting, Ethan upstairs speaking with the doctor. The air was thick with quiet and the faint scent of old wood and winter rain. Then I heard it clink, swirl, pour. I turned toward the stove, unsure what I expected. Maybe a nurse. Maybe my own memory playing tricks, but it was Ethan. He stood there, sleeves rolled, steam rising from the kettle in one hand, a teacup in the other. Not one of the house's chipped mugs, but my mother's old porcelain cup, the one with the pale blue rim and tiny crack near the handle. He didn't see me at first. He was humming quietly, a tune I hadn't heard since I was a girl, sitting cross-legged on the linoleum, watching my mother brew jasmine tea on Sunday mornings. I didn't know Ethan remembered that melody or that anyone else ever had. You're humming, I said, breaking the moment gently. He turned, slightly startled, then shrugged. It got stuck in my head. She used to hum that when she was nervous, I said, stepping closer. She thought if she kept busy with her hands, her heart wouldn't feel so loud. He placed the teacup on the table before me. No words, just that simple act of care without condition. Do you remember the first time you had tea here? I asked him. He nodded, faintly amused. Your mother offered it after she caught me sneaking. A look at one of her paintings. I didn't know that. He smiled, almost shy. I was 10. Thought I was being subtle. She said, if you're going to stare that long, you might as well come in and try the tea. I laughed, the kind of soft, surprised laugh that comes when a piece of the past clicks unexpectedly into place. She always knew when someone needed warmth. I said. He looked at me and really looked. Not like I was a debt or a duty, but like he was trying to see the part of me that remembered, the part that still carried my mother in the folds of my breath. You remind me of her, he said quietly. Not in the way you move or speak, but in the way you stay. We sat together in that kitchen, just the two of us. No business, no contracts, no quiet resentment hanging between us, just tea. Steam curled between us like a bridge, not a barrier. I watched him sip slowly, eyes downcast, the edge of his knuckles brushing the cup's handle like he was trying to steady himself on something small and porcelain and real. I should have told you everything sooner, he said after a while. I didn't answer right away. The tea was warm and my hands familiar, safe. I think, I began slowly, you did, just not with words. He tilted his head as if waiting. The tea, the humming, the letter in the Bible, the silence. Silence. It had been his language for years. Maybe for both of us that evening after we put my mother to bed, I found myself outside watching Ethan fix the latch on the garden gate. It squeaked, had always squeaked, but no one ever bothered with it, except now he did. You don't have to fix everything, I said gently. I know, he replied. But some things are worth mending. I didn't mean to walk toward him, it just happened. I stood next to him, the sky dimming to lavender above us, the earth still wet from afternoon rain. Why are you doing all this? I asked, not just the marriage, but the care, the silence, the tea. He exhaled slow and deep, looked at the gate latch in his hand, then at me. Because it's what I would have wanted someone to do for me, he said. Then quietly, because I needed to believe love could start without being asked for. Later that night I couldn't sleep. I sat by my mother's bed and watched her breathe steady, peaceful. On the table beside her, the teacup sat empty, a trace of steam still lingering in the air. It wasn't the tea itself that calmed her. It was the ritual, the effort, the unspoken promise behind it. And I realized something then, not about Ethan, but about myself. I had entered this marriage believing I was alone, powerless, owned. But here in this small kitchen with creaky floors and chipped cups, I was being shown something else, that love doesn't always announce itself with flowers or fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet, in a cup of tea made exactly the way your mother used to, by a man who still remembers her song Dot. There are rooms we inhabit, and then there are rooms we protect. Ethan had both. After we returned from my mother's house, the air between us was no longer cold. It wasn't warm either, but it had softened like frost giving way to mist. We didn't discuss what had passed. We didn't need to. Something had changed quietly, permanently. He didn't retreat into silence as I expected. In fact, he stopped retreating altogether. I began noticing him in places he'd never been before in the morning, reading in the breakfast nook, sunlight, catching in his hair. At night, walking the garden, hands tucked into his coat, face lifted toward the darkness like he was listening to it breathe. Once I passed the library and saw him at the piano, just sitting, not playing. His fingers rested gently on the keys, as if the memory of music mattered more than the sound. I didn't interrupt, but I watched, and something inside me watched back. It was on a quiet Tuesday, with rain tapping gently on the windows, that I found the door slightly ajar the east room. I had never been inside. I thought it was an office, maybe storage, but something had always told me without words that it was private, not locked, just closed. But that day, the door stood open. I knocked quietly, though it wasn't necessary. Come in, Ethan said without turning. The room surprised me. It was nothing like the rest of the house, no polished surfaces, no impersonal art. Instead, shelves of books stacked unevenly, a worn leather chair beside a small fireplace, an old record player in the corner that crackled when it spun. On the wall above the desk hung a single photograph of my mother, younger, smiling as she held up a painting in our old backyard. I walked slowly, afraid to disturb something sacred. She gave that to me, he said softly, the summer before I left. You kept it. I kept all of it. He pointed to a box near the window. I crouched down and opened it gently. Inside were old postcards, sketches, faded photographs, some of my mother, some of me as a child. One showed me sitting on the front step, clutching a stuffed rabbit, dirt on my knees, popsicle in hand. I held it like it might vanish. You were the first person who gave me a reason to feel like I wasn't temporary, he said. Back then, no one noticed me, but you waved. He smiled just a little. Every day from your porch, like I was someone worth waving to. I didn't remember it, but I didn't need to. The memory had lived inside him long enough to be real. I sat in the chair across from him. The room was quiet, but not stiff. It breathed. Around us. Why did you let me in today? I asked. He didn't answer right away. I used to think privacy was the same as protection, he said. If no one knew what mattered, then no one could take it. But that's lonely, I said. It is. He agreed. And I was good at it. He looked at me then, not guarded, not careful, just open. But lately I keep wondering what it would be like to be known, even a little. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just reached out my hand slowly and placed it on the armrest between us. He looked at it, then at me, and then without a word, he placed his hand on mine. Not to possess, not to pull, just to hold Dot, and that was enough. Dot later that night. I stood in the hallway outside the east room. The door was open, the fire inside still flickering low. There was no lock. There had never been a lock, only fear, only memory. But now the room welcomed me, and Ethan, so used to living behind walls, had begun leaving them open. Dot in our bedroom. I placed the photograph he gave me, the one of me as a child, on the bedside table beside my mother's Bible. The past and the present sat side by side. And for the first time, I no longer felt like a guest in someone else's house. I felt like I had come home. Grief doesn't always arrive like a tempest. Sometimes it comes as stillness, the kind that settles into a room before anyone speaks, that lingers in the folds of a blanket, still carrying the scent of someone you loved, that makes you whisper even when no one is sleeping. Dot, my mother died on a peaceful morning in October. There was no struggle, no gasping breath, just a soft exhale like a sigh after a long, beautiful song. I wasn't there, but Ethan was. He had arrived earlier than me that day, said he felt something. I had been running late traffic, errands, excuses that seemed so foolish now. Dot, by the time I arrived, he was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, his thumb gently tracing over her wrist, even though her pulse was already gone. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't need to. She didn't feel alone, he said softly, as if it were the only thing that mattered. And maybe it was. The funeral was small, the kind of service she would have wanted, simple, honest, a few close neighbors, some old church friends, a minister who remembered her fondly from the food pantry where she used to volunteer. No long speeches, just hymns that echo in your chest long after the last note. Ethan stood behind me the entire time, not close enough to crowd, just there. He never once tried to take my hand, but when the final hymn ended and I felt my knees begin to give, he stepped forward and placed his palm against the small of my back, a single touch. Enough to hold me up. Dot, it wasn't what people would call a romantic gesture, but I've never felt more loved in my life. We returned to the house together. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, unable to sit, unable to stand still. Grief made everything both too heavy and too hollow. Ethan brewed tea jasmine, as always, and left it on the kitchen table without a word. When I finally sat down, I noticed a small envelope beside the cup. My name written in my mother's handwriting, faded, trembling ink. The seal was unbroken. I stared at it for a long time. Some letters are like doors. You're afraid to open them because you know once you do, you can't pretend the words inside don't exist. I opened it anyway. Her voice came to me through paper and ink, steady, even in its fragility. My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means I've gone where all love eventually returns. Don't be afraid. I've had a full life, and loving you is the best part of it. I stopped reading for a moment. My chest ached. I could feel Ethan watching me from the kitchen doorway, silent. I know you were afraid the day you married him. I saw it in your eyes, even if you tried to smile through it. But I also saw something else, a seed, a chance. I didn't say anything because you needed to find it on your own. Love doesn't always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like moss on stone. It clings, it roots, it stays. Ethan is not your father, and you are not me. But both of you carry the pieces of those who came before you. And that means you get to choose what to keep and what to let go. Let go of fear, my daughter. You are stronger than you know. At the bottom of the letter was a single line. If he brings you tea the way I used to, don't push him away. That's his way of saying he's learning how to stay. I folded the letter with shaking hands. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat there, the scent of jasmine and paper rising around me like a prayer. Ethan stepped closer, as if sensing something had shifted. She wrote to you? He asked. I nodded. She wrote to us. Then I handed him the letter. He didn't read it aloud, just stood there, the envelope in one hand, his other resting gently on the back of my chair. I don't know how to be this, he whispered, but I'm trying. I looked up at him, really seeing him. This man who had once lived behind glass and contracts, now standing bare in his grief and quiet effort. You don't have to be perfect, I said. Just real. That night, we lit a candle by her window and let it burn until dawn. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Grief had settled beside us, but so had grace. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a little girl curled in my mother's lap. Safe. The maple tree behind the house was ancient, older than the porch, older than the cracked steps leading down into the yard. My mother had planted it when I was a baby, or so she used to say. It had grown tall and patient, watching over seasons of burnt pies, backyard blankets, and quiet heartbreaks. She loved that tree. In fall, the leaves would burn amber and rust, and the ground would glow for weeks with their quiet fire. That's where I found Ethan 1 week after the funeral. He was standing under the wide limbs of that maple, dressed in his usual coat, though the morning was already warm. His breath clouded slightly in the autumn air. He had one hand resting on the rough bark, his shoulders slightly bowed, the posture of a man thinking too hard or hurting too quietly. I didn't call out. I just walked toward him, slow steps through the soft grass, and stopped beside him. He turned, and for the first time since I met him, his expression held no defense, no stoicism. No polished reserve, just a quiet ache. I sold the land, he said before I could speak. I blinked. What land? The development, the forest bordering the old church. The project my board's been pushing for 3 years. He paused. It's done. I signed it away this morning. I stared at him, stunned. That land was his company's crown jewel. I'd overheard enough conversations, enough late-night phone calls to know what it meant. Prestige, power, profit. Gone. Why? I asked, barely whispering. His voice was steady, but something in it frayed around the edges. Because she loved this place, and because you did too. He looked up into the branches above us where the last golden leaves were clinging against the wind. I didn't grow up with roots, he said. We moved every time the rent was late or the silence got too loud. But this yard, this tree, this was the first place that ever felt like it belonged to someone. He looked at me. I wanted to be the kind of man who could protect that, even if it cost something. We stood there for a long time, letting the air fill the spaces where words usually rushed in. The sun was soft, caught in the gold of the leaves. The wind carried the smell of soil and something warm, like cinnamon still clinging to the kitchen. Whilst Ethan knelt and picked up a single red leaf from the grass. "She told me once," he said, holding it gently, "that the bravest thing a person can do is stay when it would be easier to run." He held the leaf out to me. "I'm staying. Not because of guilt, not because of a promise to someone who was gone, but because he wanted to." And suddenly I realized this was the proposal, not at the wedding, not in the contract, but here under a tree that had witnessed the best parts of who I used to be. I stepped forward and took the leaf from his hand. My fingers brushed his. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Then I did something I hadn't done since our first day. I reached up and touched his face, not in hesitation, but with choice. His eyes closed just for a second, as if the weight of being seen finally found a place to rest. When he opened them again, they weren't the eyes of a stranger anymore. They were the eyes of someone who had learned how to stand still. Later that afternoon, we sat together on the old porch steps, side by side, knees touching. "I don't know what comes next," I said quietly. "Neither do I," he replied. "But I want to build something that lasts. Not because I have to, but because you're the first thing I've ever wanted to stay for." And it wasn't a declaration, it was a promise, one made without ceremony, without audience. Just a man, a woman, and the tree that had known them both before. They knew themselves. It's been 1 year, a full circle of seasons, since I married Ethan Grant. Under a chandelier I didn't choose, in a dress I altered myself. So much has changed, and yet not all at once, not in fireworks, not in declarations. It happened slowly, like light at dusk, the kind that filters through the kitchen window just before dinner, stretching long across the floor, catching on dust. And recipe cards and the curve of a smile. We kept the house, not the estate. This house, the one I grew up in with the warped floorboards and the tree out back. After my mother passed, I couldn't bear the idea of strangers living here. Ethan didn't ask, he just made the arrangements. He built an addition off the back, a small reading room with windows that faced the maple tree. He kept her teacup on a high shelf next to the painting she gave him as a boy. It's a good house, not perfect, not pristine, but it holds what matters. Each morning, Ethan brews tea jasmine still. He's learned to let it steep a little longer now. He says he likes the way it lingers, the way it fills a room before a word is ever spoken. I still catch him humming sometimes, not because he's nervous anymore, but because it brings him back to something softer. He doesn't wear suits as often. He's taken to flannel shirts and warm socks and reading the newspaper in the breakfast nook, with one leg tucked under the other like a boy. And me, I've begun painting again. It started small, a sketch here, a brushstroke there. One night he came home and found me sitting at the old kitchen table, sleeves rolled, canvas half covered in burnt oranges and soft blues. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me, handed me a cup.